Hi, I'm Reed. This is Crowland Publishing. We're a narrative gaming channel, and today we're going to talk about reimagining Ravenloft. Now, Ravenloft is Wizards of the Coast, and before that, TSR's gothic horror setting, which should be my thing. And I love dark fantasy. I've done a lot of videos on horror and darkness and vampires and ghoulies and werewolves. That's the stuff that I really like. Haunted castles, women in white dresses, guys in black capes. I love all that sort of stuff. And Ravenloft should provide for us this kind of dark fantasy, horror fantasy. And it doesn't, not really. It says that it provides gothic horror, but it does. I mean, it's a pop definition of gothic rather than a literary definition of gothic, which is fine. It's more a Hammer House of Horror thing. And it's being re-released by Wizards of the Coast, but having a look over it, it just seems like more of this sort of Ravenloft doesn't provide like a really good, satisfying game setting, and I want to love Ravenloft. It is my kind of thing. So let's talk about reimagining Ravenloft and making it a lot more satisfying as a gothic horror, as a medieval, scary, dark fantasy setting for D&D, rather than just a weird, early modern Victorian era mix of problematic things that never quite work out for it. So let's get into it. Reimagining Ravenloft. So if somehow you don't know, Ravenloft was a module with a vampire called Strad von Zarovich, who has since gone on to become one of the great villains of D&D. He is an evil man who betrays his family, kills his brother, tries to sleep with his sister-in-law. It doesn't work out. He's cursed by the dark powers. He becomes a vampire lord, and he's trapped into basically, those events happen to him over and over again. And the module, which is really, really great, is based around going and killing Strad and ending this terrible cycle. It's really, really fun, and then I spin Ravenloft into its own setting, and that is where things start going wrong. But they can go right for me if you like this video. Go on, press the button. Anyway, so what the campaign revealed is that Strad's Transylvanian-inspired kingdom is in fact a prison for him, and Ravenloft as a setting is a planar prison for other Dark Lords, who are evil people who are taken from their homeworld and brought here to suffer for their sins. They are trialed by mysterious dark powers, who are said to be evil, but they're punishing evil people, so I don't know, figure that out. And Strad, of course, is not the only Dark Lord. There's a Baron Frankenstein-style Dark Lord, and he's got a monstrous domain of his own. There's a Vlad Tepes, rather than Dracula-style Dark Lord. There's a New Orleans Mardi Gras domain. There's an Island of Dr. Moreau-inspired place. There's a zombie apocalypse ruled over by a lich domain. There's a Chinese and Asian-inspired domain. And each of those little domains have goodies and baddies and NPCs and adventure locations, which should sound fantastic. They're not very gothic, and they're not all that interesting, and they're very, very limited in their scope. For example, there is a Mind Flayers location, but they just live in a pretty generic Underdark, and they're taking people over, which is the kind of adventure you could have anywhere. There's really only one adventure to have in Frankenstein land, and that's either to fight Baron Frankenstein and his monster, or help the monster against Baron Frankenstein. Island of Dr. Moreau, same thing. Do you save the monsters, or do you fight the monsters on the side of Baron Dr. Moreau, or whatever he's bloody called? I can't remember his analogous name. And I know they've redone a lot of these domains for the new campaign setting, but the problem still remains, is that ultimately you are really, really trapped into these one-off locations that don't have a lot to offer you. And that wouldn't be necessarily so bad, but the idea is that Ravenloft is a prison. You can't travel from one location to the next. There you are held in by, I think they're called thorns, but you're trapped. You can't just travel through Ravenloft as a land. And I think that is an enormous mistake. So that is my first and perhaps biggest change to Ravenloft. This is no longer a planar prison. There is no thorns. There is no barriers to traveling throughout this kingdom or this barony or however you want to imagine it. It is simply a setting that is united by common thematic elements, i.e. horror and dark fantasy. And I think that works really, really well because as it's traditionally been imagined, Ravenloft is sort of what they call a holiday in hell style campaign. You take people out of an existing fantasy world, and regardless of aesthetic, regardless of anything else, you just plop them in to vampires and tuxedos kind of world. Even if you're a Conan style Hyperborean fantasy that just does not fit at all, that just does not match at all. Suddenly you're there drinking wine with vampires. And I hate that, and I think it's always been a huge aesthetic clash for a lot of D&D. So you turn it back into medieval fantasy and just create this vast system of scary locations and scary adventures, and reimagine the Dark Lords as not necessarily these imprisoned entities, but just this is a kingdom of evil, and a lot of evil people have settled here. So let's have a look at the Dark Lords. The Dark Lords are always positioned in Ravenloft as sort of bosses. You deal with one boss at a time and then you go back to your own world, and I hate that. And I think that a lot of the time as well, is the Dark Lords don't really feel very much like these Imperial Lords of Darkness. Some do. Azalon, the good lich who rules over a zombie land. Well, he's not good, but you know what I mean. He's an interesting character. One's a werewolf who becomes a werewolf when his emotions are out of whack. It's not really great. It's a pretty typical werewolf story. There's an aristocratic swamp zombie. He's alright, but he's just an aristocratic swamp zombie. So, for starters, I would actually cut out these notions of Dark Lords at all. You don't need them to be special. You just make up a few dozen adventure locations, towns, small kingdoms, viscounties, stuff like that. And you reimagine these characters much more down close to the players. You imagine them much more as NPCs that you can interact with, that you can fight with, and you strip them a lot of that supernatural, you are imprisoned elements. These are people that you can just go and deal with and talk to, and as well is that you don't actually have to make everything evil. Sometimes people can be redeemed, sometimes people can be helped. And I think also this notion of removing Dark Lords and just giving them a place in a political power structure really, really works, because one of the Dark Lords might be just a knight, one of the Dark Lords might be a baron, one of the Dark Lords might be a duke, and they all serve under King Strahd, or Count Strahd, or Baron Strahd, whatever you want to call him. And I think that really does give more structure. You overthrow a mayor, who is a Quasimodo. You overthrow a Frankenstein monster baron, and then you take over the kingdom, and then you're ready to confront Strahd. And I think it also gives your monster hunting game a bit more nuance and texture than simply just hunting monsters, which is what a lot of horror RPGs tend to devolve into, monster hunting. In this new Ravenloft, you can run into corrupt courts of debauched nobles, lunatics with evil twins that they keep locked in the attic, werewolves who are fighting against their cursed, possessed young children. There's no end to the dark fantasy fun, especially when you bring the Dark Lords much closer to the players and you cut off this notion of that they are somehow in their own personal hell. You can introduce moral conundrums, you can introduce much more achievable victories for first level, 10th level players. So yeah, Dark Lords, chuck 'em. There's just a series of, 100 grotesque NPCs that you can kill and fight and deal with. Now, just before I go too much further, we should also quickly talk about the Vistani people. And the Vistani are an attempt to create an analogue for Romani people, for what we used to call gypsies. Now, the Romani actually inhabit a lot of Gothic horror, and certainly Ravenloft played up to a few of the stereotypes. The caravans, the bright clothes, the patriarchy, and also the fortune-telling, the tarot cards and all the rest of it, and the headscarves and the violins and the dancing and the thievery and all that sort of stuff. Now, here's the thing, is that if you want to recreate a genre, not all genres are wonderful and modern, and I don't think that the Vistani are particularly well done. I think that they do play into a few of the more, egregious stereotypes of these Romani people. But at the same time, is that they were there, they did exist historically. They did exist historically in a lot of the parts of the world that have been an inspiration for Gothic horror. So I think that you should still use them. I think the idea of a marginalized and even oppressed ethnic stereotype gives us another kind of more grounded horror. I certainly think it gives us a great base for player characters to come from. But, I really do think we have to come down from the whole, we have come to steal your horses, finger tambourines dancing around by the fireplace, wild people. It's just, it's not great. I would also completely reinvent aesthetically from the top down as a medieval horror, not a Gothic. I mean, you can call it Gothic, no one cares, but as I hinted to before, Ravenloft has always had this clash of aesthetics. You always see Vlad in a tuxedo. Mordenheim, the Frankenstein dude, is always in what is clearly 18th century gear. And there are too many aesthetics at work, and they are always clashing. The New Orleans style Mardi Gras thing, that doesn't fit into D&D style aesthetics very easily. Do you want a tricorn hat and rapiers kind of adventure? Okay, I do. I play that sort of game all the time. But do you strip your paladins and fighters of plate mail? Do you ask the barbarians to jump into hoop skirts? No, of course you don't. So I would really not create any of these Dark Lords, not create any of these locations outside of a medieval aesthetic. Barovia, Strahd's Kingdom, Dracula Kingdom. Just make it Eastern European, and then have a look at all the cool Eastern European fashions, have a look at all the cool Eastern European armor, all the fantastic buildings. They're surprisingly bright and beautiful, a lot of flower decorations. It's really quite strange. It's not at all what we think of. Have the Frankenstein land and the New Orleans place, make them medieval France. Don't have it a place of tuxedos and wristwatches. The ghost ships, make them less mateys, sort of pirate stuff. Make it a grim skeleton crew. Dun, dun, dun. Oh no, the white ship has found us. Now, I mean, you could always just provide rules to make it a bit easier to run an early modern time period inspired game, a Musketeers more inspired game, even a Victorian era inspired game, but that's not the strengths of Dungeons and Dragons. That's the strength of a game setting like 7th Sea or even Castle Falkenstein. Do you want to play D&D or do you want to play those other games? We're talking D&D today. So, no. Don't worry about it. Just reimagine it as medieval horror, because there's surprisingly little medieval horror. Now, I think that my last criticism of Ravenloft is that right now it's sort of just a grab bag, a bricolage, and a patchwork of classic Gothic stories that you're trying to recreate. So you've got a Dracula bit, you've got a Hunchback of Notre Dame bit, you've got a Woman in Black bit, and sometimes you even shoehorn in other genres like Mind Flayers, who just, they're a cosmic horror, they just don't fit in. So I would immediately stop trying to recreate specific stories, specific novels, specific movies, and focus more on recreating horror subgenres. Spiderpunk horror. Make a land of warring lycanthropes who are tearing up innocent people and monstrous serial killers. If you want to do creeping paranoia, that's where you bring in, a Mind Flayers. They used to call it horror of personality. What do you know? How can you trust yourself? Who's real? Who's got their own free will? Do a witch-haunted lands for that folk horror of ancient trees and weird runestones. An undead horde lands for zombie horror. Do a demon who possesses all the children in town and marches them off to sacrifice. All these different kinds of horror should be represented in Ravenloft. I think also that you should provide a dark fantasy, not necessarily horror element to the game. I mean, dark fantasy is just, fantasy with a bit of scary monsters now and again and a bit of edginess to it all. Make Strahd's Kingdom, for example, a place where you can really fight back against the monsters, where you're fighting up against lycanthrope kings and rogue vampire lords and all the rest of that. I would also bring in some Dark Souls, Bloodborne-style cosmic horror. Who made Strahd a vampire? What entities support him? And I think you should do that because to a new generation of players, the Soulsborne's games and that whole dark medieval aesthetic is what medieval horror looks like. And it's also really, really fun and really, really interesting to play in those more over-the-top dark fantasy games. I'm running out of time, man. I would also like to provide rules for playing as monsters, to be a flesh golem or a werewolf or a vampire. And I also think that you should keep in mind that this is rooted in early medieval time period, so you should have stuff like plagues and witch burnings. Focus on more mundane horrors, and I'd also really look at using slightly different influences. Take medieval Spain, take medieval China. They all have these particularly great folklores that you can get a lot of scary horror out of. Alright, let's get to the summary. So what does Ravenloft look like under my diabolical control? Firstly, no longer a planar prison, this is just a horror kingdom. Get rid of the domains being separate as well, you've got to be able to travel from place to place. The Dark Lords have become more grounded, they're NPCs that you can deal with and fight and play cards with and eat with, they're not these special snowflakes of cosmic significance. Reimagine the entire kingdom as medieval, don't have these competing aesthetics, and then focus on recreating horror and dark fantasy genres, not the specific stories. Different kinds of horror for different kind of players and different kind of kingdoms. Man, I kind of really want to write this setting now. Anyway, I'm Reed. I hope you enjoyed this ideas about Ravenloft. I hope it was useful to you. Thank you very much for listening. Please give us a like and a share and a subscribe. I'm on Twitter. We're on Facebook under Crowland Pub, where I'm quite active. Thank you very much. Really hope you enjoyed it. See you next time. Bye-bye.